modern society operates on a fundamental biological delusion. You are constantly instructed to cure your anxiety. You are sold optimization protocols and behavioral therapies. This is a complete misdiagnosis of the human nervous system. You do not possess a clinical anxiety disorder. Your brain is functioning exactly as evolution programmed it. You are experiencing pure neurological terror. This is the unmedicated reality of possessing conscious free will. You must execute constant choices in an entirely indifferent universe. Watch closely how this organism reacts to absolute safety. It is 9 p.m. An individual sits motionless on a fabric sofa. Their right hand tightly grips a plastic television remote. The retina scans a digital interface displaying 4,000 distinct titles. There is zero environmental threat in the room. Yet, a severe physiological stress response initiates. The masseter muscles in the jaw involuntarily clench. The teeth press together to absorb the tension. The diaphragm restricts its movement. Breathing becomes rapid and excessively shallow. Airflow is entirely confined to the upper chest cavity. This repetitive scrolling behavior continues for exactly 22 minutes. The adrenal glands respond to the internal friction. They flood the bloodstream with a measurable spike in cortisol. The organism reaches an acute threshold of computational exhaustion. The thumb finally presses a button to terminate the selection process. They select a sitcom episode. They have already processed this exact audio-visual sequence 14 times prior. The physical collapse is immediate. The spinal erectors disengage entirely. The body slumps back into the foam cushions. A rapid exhalation occurs the millisecond. The familiar theme song begins. These predictable auditory frequencies forcefully override the brain's computational loop. The severe cognitive load is instantly neutralized. But here is the brutal physical reality. Why does the mere presence of infinite choices force the brain into this state? Why does a standard streaming menu trigger this specific neurochemical sequence? Why does the human nervous system process absolute freedom, exactly like being hunted by an apex predator? The actual fatal mechanism is a severe neurological failure. Freedom of choice is inherently traumatizing to your nervous system. This is a biological absolute. It demands the biological impossibility of predicting an unknowable future. When you face open-ended choices with no guaranteed outcomes, your anterior cingulate cortex detects a massive computational error. This conflict monitoring center registers a violent discrepancy. It sees a chasm between current reality and multiple potential futures. The anterior cingulate cortex immediately signals the amygdala. It initiates a preemptive stress response. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is forcefully activated. High concentrations of cortisol are pumped into your bloodstream. Simultaneously, the prefrontal cortex attempts to simulate outcomes to regain control. But the variables of real life are infinite. The prefrontal cortex enters an endless computational loop. The brain interprets this lack of predictive certainty as an imminent physical threat. Watch closely how they react. A professional sits before a laptop computer. They are tasked with writing a resignation letter. They are pursuing a career path completely devoid of financial verification. The cursor blinks. Their heart rate uncontrollably elevates to 95 beats per minute. Peripheral vasoconstriction occurs instantly. Blood is forcibly drawn away from the extremities back to the core. Their fingertips become physically cold. The moment their skin touches the keyboard, the physiological discomfort peaks. In less than 1.5 seconds, a violent motor compulsion takes over. Their hand quickly moves to the trackpad. They open a new browser tab. They check an email inbox that was already processed 4 minutes prior. This is a subconscious, motor-driven compulsion. They must execute a predictable action to force a microdose of dopamine. They need this chemical drop to suppress the death alarm from the anterior cingulate cortex. Chronic activation of the sympathetic nervous system leads to severe allostatic load. the individual becomes physically paralyzed by their own massive potential. They are trapped in a state of perpetual physiological stalling, but the brain cannot sustain this state of computational paralysis indefinitely. The resulting structural damage to neural tissue would be irreversible. So the brain engineers a ruthless defense mechanism. It implements a culturally sanctioned psychological blindness. Human society functions primarily as a collective coping mechanism. It is designed to neurologically absolve you of the responsibility of choice. To avoid the metabolic cost of individuation, your brain defaults to the dorsal striatum. This is the primitive region governing habit and stimulus response behaviors. Through deindividuation, you surrender personal agency to biological conformity. The brain actively decreases activation in the medial prefrontal cortex. This neural tissue handles self-reflection and autobiographical memory. The physical result is that you literally think less about yourself. Hyper-consumerism and status-seeking act as exogenous regulators. They hijack the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. They create high-intensity, predictable reward loops. These actions artificially drown out the hyperactivity of the default mode network. This is the exact neural system responsible for existential rumination. Watch closely how they react. A 30-year-old mid-level manager attends a corporate networking event. They hold a glass of alcohol precisely at chest level. It functions as a rigid physical barrier. They precisely mirror the posture and breathing cadence of the senior director speaking to them. They deploy rehearsed, industry-specific vocabulary. Suddenly, a colleague asks an unscripted question. It is a direct inquiry about their actual life aspirations outside of work. The manager's pupils momentarily dilate. Their gaze violently breaks contact, darting directly to the synthetic carpet. They immediately execute a large physical swallow of alcohol. The liquid coats the gastric mucosa. Within 3 seconds, they pivot the conversation back to quarterly market metrics. They physically force their vocal cords to project a louder, more assertive tone. This acoustic vibration blocks the intrusion of cognitive dissonance. This is the systematic atrophy of the authentic self. The individual operates exclusively on predetermined neural scripts. They execute biological survival but completely abandon conscious agency. This neurochemical anesthesia is strictly temporary. When the external stimuli are physically removed, the suppressed neural networks rebound. A devastating psychological collapse initiates. The continuous refusal to process existential anxiety breeds intro-psychic depression. This transforms daily existence into a state of agonizing mechanical friction. The actual fatal mechanism is rooted in the neuroplasticity of learned helplessness. By constantly delegating life choices to conformity, physical damage occurs. Synapses in the neural pathways associated with internal locus of control are physically pruned away. The dopaminergic reward system becomes severely blunted. The brain no longer produces anticipatory dopamine for intrinsic, self-directed goals. The individual is functionally incapable of experiencing motivation without extreme external pressure. You are not biologically depressed. You are suffering from an acquired deficit of meaning. Watch closely how they react. An individual wakes up at exactly 3:14 a.m. There is no external noise or physical threat in the bedroom. They lie entirely supine, staring dead at the ceiling. The physiological presentation includes a heavy, restrictive sensation in the sternum. This is caused by subconscious intercostal muscle tension. They experience a total inability to expand the diaphragm fully. They physically reach for their smartphone on the nightstand. Their face remains entirely flat, devoid of all micro-expressions. Their thumb swipes vertically through short-form video content. This precise mechanical action continues for 45 consecutive minutes. Their eyes are glazed over. Saccadic eye movements become exceptionally slow and labored. They are executing a dead robotic motor pattern. They are desperately trying to generate enough sensory noise. They must drown out the sudden, deafening realization that they wasted the last decade of their life. The final clinical consequence is total biological apathy. This is the psychological death of the individual. They become a passive observer trapped inside a deteriorating biological vessel. But here is the brutal physical reality. To escape this living death, the organism must execute a violent reversal. You must learn to intentionally override your own biological survival instincts. You must deliberately walk your physical body into the neurochemical fire of uncertainty. Meaning is never discovered objectively. It is biologically synthesized through irrational, total commitment to a subjective truth. You must act in direct, physical defiance of the brain's fear centers. This leap is the extreme application of top-down cognitive control. You commit your physical body to a passion without any objective guarantee of success. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex asserts direct inhibitory control over the amygdala. You do not stop feeling the severe physical fear. You force the motor cortex to execute the action. Anyway, the brain observes the body taking severe risks for a specific goal. Through self-perception theory, it reverse engineers a sense of profound meaning. The biological anxiety is not eliminated. It is violently metabolically repurposed. The exact cortisol and adrenaline that previously caused paralysis now function differently. They provide the aggressive physiological arousal necessary for sustained, high-focus pursuit. Watch closely how they react. An artist prepares to publish a highly controversial, deeply personal piece of work. Their index finger hovers exactly 5 millimeters over the publish button. Their physical baseline is entirely identical to a clinical panic attack. Their hands exhibit an uncontrollable, high-frequency tremor. Their core body temperature drops sharply, causing immediate shivering. They are aggressively sweating through their cotton clothing. They possess absolutely zero data, proving this action will not ruin their reputation. Yet, instead of withdrawing, their thoracic spine extends. They lean their entire physical body weight forward into the desk. They forcefully exhale, dropping their shoulder muscles completely. They violently press the mechanical key. They accept the pure physical terror and physically act right through it. This is the biological synthesis of an authentic, realized self. The individual successfully transmutes the anxiety of existence. It goes from a fatal inhibitor of action into the raw chemical fuel of meaning. Your biological machinery guarantees that you will be consumed by existential anxiety. This is an inescapable mathematical certainty. Your only true freedom lies in exactly how you allocate that anxiety. You can spend it entirely passively. You can run from your own freedom until your neural pathways atrophy. You will sink into a state of permanent, apathetic despair. Or you can spend it actively. You can weaponize your physical fear to forge a subjective truth. The physiological cost is exactly the same. The elevated resting heart rate is identical. The internal corrosion from cortisol is identical. The sleepless nights, driven by sympathetic nervous system arousal, are identical, but the existential return on investment is fundamentally different. It is the physical difference between a life actually lived and a biological vessel merely survived. Identify a single, significant decision you are currently deferring. You claim you need more information. You claim you are waiting for the optimal time. Recognize that your hesitation is not high-level, intellectual calculation. It is a primitive, physiological freeze response. Within 60 seconds of this realization, execute one irreversible microaction. Send the email. Make the financial transfer. Schedule the physical confrontation. Force your prefrontal cortex to violently override your limbic system. Do it right now while your hands are physically shaking. If you are prepared to dismantle the comforting illusions of your daily behavior. If you want to examine the harsh mechanics of human reality, subscribe. We will continue to dissect the truth here.